Hey y'all, Laura here with another edition of The Right Stuff. I was trying to think of what to talk about this time, and a friend of mine suggested that I talk about how I got my agent. And the point of this is to look outside the box. We all query, we all pitch when we get the opportunity, but there are other ways of getting an agent. And I just want you to be aware that they are there, they're legitimate, and that they work. I am a slow learner. I started writing 15 years before I sold a book. I wrote the first book, decided I didn't want to erase it, I wanted it published. So I queried 150 agents, every agent that I could find that would take what I wrote. As you can imagine, the rejections poured in. So, while waiting to hear on those, I started my next book. And I learned a ton. I joined RWA, I'd been to conferences, I took classes, I took Margie Lawson's immersion classes, which made all the difference in my writing. So I queried that second book, and I got a couple of requests for fulls, but ultimately all 135 or so agents that I'd queried rejected it. So, of course, lather, rinse, repeat, I wrote another book. This one I felt was special. My crick group thought it was sure to sell. My writing was good. Good enough to be published. So I threw out 150 more queries and waited. And I entered contests. And I won a bunch of contests with it. And even so, the rejections just poured in. I was at the end of my patience, the end of my wits, the end of my agent list. I still had maybe one or two fulls out, but it wasn't looking good. My local RWA chapter, the best on the planet, by the way, OCCRWA, was having an editor come in to speak to our group for our meeting that month. And one of the board members said, "You work close to the airport. Why don't you pick her up?" Well, I wasn't going to turn down that opportunity. So I picked her up at the airport and we started on our way. It couldn't have been 20 miles. But this is Southern California on a Friday afternoon. And as it turned out, there was a tanker overturn on the freeway. Score for me, right? This poor woman was in the car with me for 2 hours. We talked about bicycling, which we were both interested in. We talked about Michigan, which is where we both came from. We talked about the market. We talked about the downturn of Borders, which at the time was on a death spiral. And then eventually she asked me, "So what do you write?" I pitched her my book right there in my car, stalled in traffic, and she said, "That sounds interesting. Why don't you send me a proposal?" So I reached into my back seat and handed it to her. That, by the way, just so you know, is a no-no. But I had no pride. I wanted to sell my book. So she looked a little taken aback, but she took it and said, "Okay, I'll read it on the plane on the way back." And I thought, yeah, you say that, but sure enough, Monday morning, she got in touch with me via email and said, You know, the first thing we need to do is get you an agent. Yeah, like I hadn't thought of that. But she introduced me to my perfect agent, Nalinia Koliker of Spencer Hill Associates, and we went on from there. The book did not sell to that particular editor, but it did sell, and it was the sweet spot, which eventually ended up double finaling in the Rita, and it won the Rita that year for Best First Book. So, 417 rejections before I got an agent. So, my point is for this, put yourself out there. Think outside the box. There are other ways to get an agent than the normal routes. Put yourself in the way of success. So until next time, see y'all.